What if I told you that the same man who saved a billion people from starvation also invented the method used to murder millions in gas chambers? That a Nobel Prize winner personally supervised the first chemical weapons attack in history, then spent his final years as a fugitive, betrayed by the very regime he helped build? This is the story of Fritz Haber, a genius who gave humanity the ability to feed itself, and the monster who weaponized science in ways the world had never imagined. His inventions won wars. His discoveries ended famines. His legacy is written in both bread and blood. This is the story of the chemist who made a deal with the devil and discovered the devil was wearing his own face. In the early 1900s, humanity faced an existential crisis that few people today even know existed. The world was running out of food, not because of drought or disease, but because of chemistry. Crops need nitrogen to grow, and natural sources, animal manure, crop rotation, guano deposits, couldn't keep pace with the exploding global population. Scientists calculated that by the 1930s, mass starvation would be inevitable. Hundreds of millions would die. The problem was simple but seemingly insurmountable. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe, but plants can't use it in that form. It needs to be fixed, converted into compounds like ammonia that plants can absorb. Nature does this slowly through bacteria and soil. Humanity needed to do it industrially, at scale, or face catastrophe. Chemists around the world attacked the problem. It became the scientific challenge of the age, with national prestige and the fate of civilization hanging in the balance. In 1909, a brilliant but troubled German Jewish chemist named Fritz Haber succeeded. Working in his laboratory, Haber discovered how to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen using high pressure, high temperature, and a catalyst. It sounds simple now, but it required solving problems that had stumped chemistry for decades. The Haber-Bosch process, named after Haber and the engineer who scaled it to industrial production, transformed human civilization. Suddenly, fertilizer could be manufactured in unlimited quantities. The green revolution that would eventually feed billions became possible. Haber received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. He was celebrated as the savior of humanity. But there was another side to Haber's ammonia synthesis, one that would turn his triumph into tragedy. The same process that created fertilizer could create explosives, and in 1914, as Europe descended into World War I, Fritz Haber would make a choice that would haunt him and humanity forever. When World War I began, Fritz Haber was 46 years old, a patriotic German who desperately wanted his country to win and his own contributions to be recognized. As a Jewish man in Imperial Germany, he had faced discrimination his entire life. He had converted to Christianity to advance his career. He had worked obsessively to prove himself more German than the Germans, more patriotic, more willing to sacrifice. When the German military came to him with a request, he didn't hesitate. They wanted him to weaponize chemistry. The war had stalled into brutal trench warfare. Millions of men faced each other across no man's land, neither side able to break through. The German high command believed chemical weapons could end the stalemate. They needed a scientist brilliant enough to make it happen. Haber threw himself into the work with frightening enthusiasm. He gathered Germany's greatest chemists, many of them future Nobel Prize winners themselves, into a secret research unit. They tested various gases, delivery methods, and concentrations. Haber himself traveled to the front lines to supervise field tests, treating soldiers as experimental subjects. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, Fritz Haber personally oversaw the first large-scale chemical weapons attack in human history. German soldiers opened 6,000 cylinders containing 168 tons of chlorine gas. A greenish-yellow cloud, heavier than air, drifted across no man's land toward French and Algerian colonial troops. What happened next was beyond anything warfare had seen before. The gas burned through lungs, dissolved mucous membranes, caused hemorrhaging and asphyxiation. Men drowned in their own bodily fluids. Those who survived were often blinded or suffered permanent lung damage. The psychological impact was just as devastating. the invisible, creeping horror of poisoned air. Estimates vary, but that first attack killed between 5,000 and 10,000 men and injured thousands more. Haber watched through binoculars from a nearby hill. When asked later about his feelings, he reportedly said it was one of the greatest moments of his life, a breakthrough in military science. But not everyone agreed. When Haber returned home, his wife Clara, herself a brilliant chemist and the first woman to earn a doctorate from the University of Breslau, confronted him. She called his work a perversion of science and barbarism. She begged him to stop. They argued violently. Clara said he had brought shame on their name and on science itself. On May 2, 1915, just 10 days after the gas attack at Ypres, Clara Immerwahr took her husband's service revolver into their garden and shot herself in the heart. She died in the arms of their 13-year-old son. The next morning, Fritz Haber left for the Eastern Front to oversee more chemical weapons tests. Clara's suicide did nothing to slow Haber's work. If anything, he doubled down. Over the next 3 years, Haber's research unit developed increasingly sophisticated chemical weapons. Chlorine was just the beginning. They created phosgene, which was deadlier and harder to detect. They developed mustard gas, which didn't just kill, but caused horrific blistering and long-term injuries. By war's end, chemical weapons had caused over 1 million casualties. The psychological trauma affected millions more. Entire generations of soldiers returned home with permanent lung damage, blindness, and nightmares of choking in yellow clouds. The other side responded in kind. British, French, and eventually American chemists developed their own chemical weapons. The genie Haber released could not be put back in the bottle. But here's what's truly disturbing. Fritz Haber never expressed remorse. In his view, all weapons kill, and chemical weapons were simply more efficient. He argued that by making war more horrific, chemical weapons would actually shorten conflicts and save lives in the long run. It was a rationalization that would echo through the 20th century, that greater weapons of horror would somehow lead to peace. After Germany's defeat in 1918, Haber was placed on Allied war crimes lists. The British and French wanted to try him at an international tribunal for crimes against humanity. Yet simultaneously, the Swedish Academy awarded him the Nobel Prize for his ammonia synthesis work, the process that had also enabled Germany to manufacture explosives throughout the war. The ceremony was controversial and bitter. Scientists from Allied nations boycotted. Protesters gathered outside. The man who had saved humanity from starvation and the man who had pioneered chemical warfare accepted the same prize. Haber himself seemed unbothered by the contradiction. In his acceptance speech, he spoke of duty to nation and the inevitability of scientific progress. But the worst ironies were yet to come. After the war, Haber continued his work, now focusing on civilian applications. He remained director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, one of Germany's most prestigious research facilities. In the 1920s, his institute developed a pesticide called Zyklon A, a cyanide-based fumigant for controlling insects in grain stores and ships. It was later refined into a more stable form. Zyklon B Haber had no role in developing Zyklon B's final formulation and never intended it for anything but pest control. But the compound his institute created would become the instrument of the Holocaust. Here, the story becomes almost unbearably tragic. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Fritz Haber, the patriotic German who had converted to Christianity, who had served his country without question, who had personally pioneered Germany's chemical warfare program, discovered that none of it mattered. To the Nazis, he was simply a Jew. The regime began purging Jewish scientists from universities and research institutes. Haber, despite his immense prestige and contributions to Germany, was forced to resign from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. The man who had valued German nationalism above his own life, above his wife's life, above the lives of thousands of soldiers he had poisoned, discovered that the nationalism he worshipped had no place for him. Colleagues he had mentored refused to defend him. Organizations he had built rejected him. The country he had served betrayed him utterly. Fritz Haber became a refugee. Broken, ill, and isolated, he left Germany in 1933. The British, who had once wanted to try him as a war criminal, now offered sanctuary. He traveled through Europe searching for a place that would accept him until his health finally failed. On January 29, 1934, Fritz Haber died of heart failure in a hotel room in Basel, Switzerland. He was 65 years old, alone, and in exile. Less than a decade later, the poison gas his institute had developed was being used in chambers at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other death camps, killing millions, including many of Haber's own relatives. His legacy had come full circle in the most horrific way imaginable. The story of Fritz Haber is not simply a tale of good and evil. It's far more complex and disturbing than that. Haber genuinely believed he was serving a higher purpose. He saw science as a tool for national greatness and human progress. The fact that the same discovery could feed billions or kill millions wasn't, to him, a moral question. It was simply the dual nature of all-powerful technology. Modern chemists and historians remain deeply divided on Haber's legacy. Some argue he should be remembered primarily for his ammonia synthesis, a discovery that has literally kept billions of people alive. Without the Haber-Bosch process, modern agriculture would be impossible. The world's population would be a fraction of what it is. In purely utilitarian terms, he has saved more lives than perhaps any other single human being. Others point out that this calculation ignores the moral weight of his choices. Haber didn't just make a discovery that others weaponized. He personally and enthusiastically led the weaponization. He wasn't a passive scientist whose work was misused. He was an active participant in creating weapons of mass suffering. The tragedy deepens when we consider what drove him: a desperate need for acceptance and recognition from a society that would ultimately reject him anyway. Haber thought that by serving German nationalism zealously enough, by proving his loyalty beyond question, he would transcend his Jewish heritage. Instead, he created weapons that failed to win the war he fought for, destroyed his family, earned him eternal infamy, and led to technology that would eventually be used to murder people of his own background. Was Haber evil? Deluded? Brilliantly naive? A victim of his time and circumstances? Perhaps the most unsettling answer is that he was simply human, capable of extraordinary genius and terrible moral blindness simultaneously. His story reveals something about the nature of scientific progress that we still struggle with today. Knowledge itself is neutral, but knowledge combined with ambition, nationalism, and moral indifference becomes dangerous beyond measure. The ghost of Fritz Haber haunts us still. Every scientist working on dual-use technology, artificial intelligence that could liberate or enslave, biotechnology that could cure or kill, nuclear physics that could power cities or destroy them, walks in Haber's shadow. His rationalization that efficiency in warfare is somehow humane, that making war more terrible will make it shorter, echoes in every debate about drone strikes, autonomous weapons, and cyber warfare. His tragedy that nationalism and ideology will always betray those who serve them blindly remains relevant in an age of rising authoritarianism and ethnic tension. Most disturbingly, his legacy proves that good intentions and brilliant minds offer no protection against moral catastrophe. Haber didn't consider himself evil. He thought he was a patriot, a scientist, a man serving his nation and humanity. The fact that he was wrong, tragically, completely wrong, should terrify everyone who believes in progress, science, and the power of human reason. Because if Fritz Haber could make those mistakes, so can we. The scientists who developed Agent Orange thought they were helping end a war. The chemists who created CFCs thought they were making life better. The engineers who designed social media algorithms thought they were connecting humanity. Good intentions, brilliant minds, and powerful technology are not enough. Without wisdom, without humility, without the courage to refuse when conscience demands it, science becomes a weapon that destroys its creators. In 2015, the city of Karlsruhe, Germany, renamed the plaza in front of the building where Fritz Haber once worked. It had been called Fritz Haber Platz since 1960. Now it's simply called University Plaza. His name, like his legacy, is too complicated to display publicly. The ammonia synthesis that feeds the world continues every day in factories across the globe. The chemical weapons he pioneered are now banned by international treaty, though nations still develop them in secret. The poison gas his institute created sits in museums behind glass, a reminder of industrial murder. And every year, billions of people eat food grown with fertilizers made possible by Haber's process, never knowing that the same chemistry that sustains them once killed by the thousands. Perhaps that's the final lesson of Fritz Haber's life. We are all living with the consequences of choices made by brilliant, flawed, desperate people who thought they understood what they were doing. We all benefit from discoveries that came at terrible cost. We all live in a world built by those who made deals with devils, or who became devils themselves while believing they were heroes. The line between savior and destroyer, between genius and monster, between feeding billions and poisoning millions, that line is thinner than we want to believe. It runs right through the human heart. And the most terrifying part? Fritz Haber never saw himself as a villain. Even at the end, dying in exile, betrayed by everything he'd sacrificed for, he still believed he had done the right thing. What would you sacrifice for success? For recognition? For your country? For science? And how would you know when you'd gone too far? If this story disturbed you, challenged your assumptions, or made you question the nature of progress and morality, then hit that subscribe button. History's darkest chapters contain its most important lessons, and the truth is always more complicated than we want it to be.